Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise this afternoon to make my contributions on the Animal Welfare Amendment Bill 2022 and indicate at this point that Tasmanian Labor are supportive of the amendment bill. I've listened with interest with the former Minister for Primary Industries and Water, who's carrying this through the lower house, and the narration of the process to this point, and I haven't been around. It was the substantive bill is 1993, a long time ago, and I understand there's been a couple of efforts of making amendments to the bill. But I think it's really important at the outset to state that the original Act was formed a long time ago. There has been a large shift in community sentiment around animals and the welfare of animals, and a large shift in the expectation of our community about how animals, whether they be personal pets loved in the home, whether they be livestock loved on the farm, or whether they be wildlife, communities are now engaged with and rely on animals for so many parts of their life, and rely heavily in many circumstances for living a full and active and engaged life as a result of their relationship with their animals. And so I think, yes, this amendment bill does represent a movement towards quality animal welfare legislation. However, it is absolutely clear that this is not the end of the road in terms of a suite of amendments that will need to land so that Tasmania can say we have fantastic animal welfare legislation in this state. Having said that, and spent quite a lot of time interrogating the reasons for these amendments, the ways that they've been framed and presented, and also asking questions around matters that haven't been tabled for amendment today, I can understand where the state is on its journey, but absolutely implore the state to continue doing work to make sure that Tasmania does progress towards quality animal welfare legislation. And I do want to go through the amendments that have been proposed and just outline my understanding of the purposes of those. Obviously, any time we can make improvements to prosecution processes, any time we can strengthen powers for officers, clarify definitions, or in fact correct errors in the substantive act, then those things should be supported. The consultation, and again I think this is really important to make this point before we head into what potentially will be a long discussion around this bill. The consultation was really rich for this set of amendments. There were, as I understand, 89 submissions received, although curiously, and I've only taken one piece of legislation or responded to one piece of legislation so far in my time here, but it said that 4 of them were blank, so I'm not sure whether that was an error and people had made submissions but they weren't successfully received, or they, in error, submitted something. And so I hope that in the final set of submissions that everybody that had intended to submit had their submissions received. But again, with the number of pieces of legislation I've seen come through this House, that's quite a significant number of submissions, and it indicates the depth of care and determination, professionalism, because a lot of them are from organisations, but a lot of them are personal around their reflections on the need for quality animal welfare legislation in Tasmania. And I think it's important to acknowledge how many there were, because I know there's going to be some proposed amendments over the evening, and I think it's important that all changes are given an opportunity to be considered broadly across the community. Because when you're talking about, and I mentioned it before, whether you're talking about pets in a home, whether you're talking about livestock on a farm, or whether you're talking about wildlife, there are a broad range of stakeholders and individuals that would want to understand what is actually progressing and happening in this place with amendments. So just going through the amendments and the support of Tasmanian Labor for these amendments, and I'm just doing them in the amendments have been raised in various order in different sort of documents, so going through them in no particular order, I'm really pleased to see that where there's an allegation made in terms of cruelty to an animal, it's not simply okay for someone to deny that they have ownership of that animal, and that creating an evidentiary presumption where it reverses that onus onto an individual, I think, is really important. In the submissions that I read and the conversations that I've had and with the documentation provided, I think it's really important to clarify that that doesn't change the onus of being able to set the standard of the complaint, but it just says that you can't simply say, well, it wasn't my animal, it wasn't in my possession, and therefore not have that responsibility. So really supportive of that amendment coming through. Also very supportive of the amendment that comes through that increases the power to take possession of animals. There have been circumstances in the past where if you understand that something's likely to happen, you still can't act, and you've got to wait until an event has occurred before actually you can take action. And so there are always circumstances, we know, that if you reasonably believe that one or more of events are going to occur, that we should be able to support our officers to take action. So that's a really important amendment that's being proposed here. Similarly with the emergency entry powers, if there's an urgent need and there's an animal that's in imminent or actual danger, then it's really important that we make that amendment, and again that support for animals isn't delayed. Another one that was interesting to me, again because I'm going through legislation often for the first time with this sort of level of detail, an idea or the amendment where you can actually be charged with an offence, and if you're not successful in actually having a charge of that offence, then a subsequent charge can be made where you don't have to actually have duplication of effort in the first instance. So the provision for an alternative verdict, I think, is an important update that's been made to this legislation. And it's already been outlined by the Minister that provided this information, but where in the past there may have been an incident occur or an event occur, but the person, either themselves or the evidence to support an outcome or a verdict is actually in another state, then that has prevented charges occurring in Tasmania. So to make sure that we have extraterritorial applications of the power to require information is also obviously a really important update to this Act. There was some commentary on a way that you reduce the time for carcasses, the amount of time a carcass has to be kept, and there was some confusion actually in the consultation and with some submissions that were made that it was reducing the time of an animal being held before the animal was euthanised. And in fact, it's once that event has occurred, then the amount of time that the carcass has to be kept. And as the Minister outlined, it did raise with me some interest that this amendment was about the capacity to store carcasses as opposed to any other sort of important reason, but understanding that there were no negative submissions in terms of the reduction of time, but a misunderstanding in the consultation. And I think it's worth putting on record here that throughout the consultation, as I mentioned, a large number of submissions, as a result of the consultation, clarification was provided. I know some people that made a submission, they had a large range of questions that actually could have caused other questions to occur in the community. They were able, as a result of the consultation, to have their questions answered and have not included their submission in the documentation here for want of confusing the community and others around the nature of their questions. So it's great to see, as a result of consultation, that amendments were made to the amendments. Some things were removed, but also clarification was provided. The clarification to the definition of disposal, there was an assumption by many through the use of the Act that disposal meant euthanase, and it doesn't simply mean that, but it might be that it's rehomed or that it's sold, that the ownership changes. So that's been an important improvement in the definition. As outlined, the cost recovery process, that there's not such a significant delay in the recovery of funds that could in fact have been years. So again, another improvement. And I just wanted to outline, and I think it is important with one of the recommended amendments was under the animal research area. There were 19 submissions that opposed an amendment, and on reflection then it was determined the baiting and shooting as a research exemption, it was determined that no longer proceed, and that amendment was abandoned. However, included or to remain included was the officer not to be threatened, intimidated or abused, and to ensure that officers are protected similarly with that. And finally, I just wanted to finish on what I feel. It seems to me that almost all of these amendments are just about tidying up or correcting or improving what was already intended, as opposed to really adding anything new. However, there is one very new amendment to this which is really important, and that is the banning of pronged collars. Now that's an issue that emotional for so many, and particularly for those animal pet owners that have their deep relationships with their pets and can see or understand pets being trained or managed by another person in a way that isn't appropriate for an animal. So I think this is compared to a lot of the other provisions in these amendments, this is a significant amendment, and that Tasmanian Labor absolutely support. I know in the consultation there was a deep list of a lot of other suggestions of things that could be considered within this amendment. And I reflect back on the reading that I've done and the understanding that I have about the time that has occurred from 1993 to now. There has been one small set of amendments that have gone through, some work on the legislation, but there was a significant attempt to make amendments to the Act. If by memory it was in 2014, I might be wrong on that. However, it failed.
I don't think it did. I think that's an error in the submission.
2014?
Yeah.
My understanding is, not from reading but from a conversation, is that there was a large suite of amendments. There was an attempt to have it journey both through the upper house and the lower house, and that it wasn't successful. And that has caused some people that I've talked to be what I would call potentially conservative or moderate in their discussions with me around how much work can be done at one time to ensure that there's successful outcomes in order for not to have progress made. And so Tasmanian Labor have taken the position to support this suite of amendments. We believe that it's really important, particularly with the banning of the use of pronged collars. However, in supporting this suite of amendments, urge the government to continue to not see this at the end of the road. This is definitely not the end of the road for improvements to animal welfare legislation in Tasmania, and to continue to identify suites of changes that need to be made to bring us up to what would be contemporary and best practice animal welfare legislation in Tasmania. And that might mean that the 1993 legislation requires amendments, but it also might mean an open mind to a new structure to animal welfare legislation in Tasmania. So Tasmanian Labor support the amendments as written, and urge the government to continue the process of making amendments to this legislation, and look forward to hearing the conversation through the House this afternoon.